This isn't as simple as just wave a magic wand and your policy fix suddenly will solve everything. But it does require a lot more intentionality around policy design, program design, implementation, all of that, decision making at the regulatory level, because the concern that a lot of folks have is, where is this going to stop?
I'm Carolyn Parrs, communicator, coach, and host of Just Power, a podcast about creating a clean energy future without leaving anyone behind. Join me as we explore the technologies, policies, and human stories that can make clean energy not just sustainable for our planet, but accessible for everyone. Welcome to Just Power. Hi, I'm Carolyn Parrs. When food prices seem so out of control right now, electricity is now being called the new eggs. Another cost of living spike that is leaving so many people feeling powerless. Over the last year, utility bills didn't just rise, they became an economic stressor, a political issue, and for millions of households, a breaking point. So we're launching Season 5 of Just Power with a focus series on energy affordability. And I brought together national data, community voices, real people, right? Community voices and leadership perspectives to explore what's driving these pressures and what credible, people-centered responses would actually look like. So to set the stage, we're going to begin with the data. And my guest today is Charles Hua. He is the CEO of Powerlines. And their new national report shows utilities requested, are you ready, nearly $31 billion in rate hikes in 1 year. And that's affected over 80 million people. That's 1 in every 3 people at a moment when households are already stressed out between heat, paying for heat, and food, and childcare, medicine. So this conversation today lays the groundwork for everything that follows in this season. So welcome, Charles.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So before we get into the numbers, and I know there are a lot, right? I'd love for you to zoom out for a moment, right? And when you look at the data in your new report, what story is it telling about what's happening with energy affordability right now? And why is this moment different from past cycles, right, of rising costs?
Well, I think we're in a energy affordability crisis right now. And what makes this moment different is that, frankly, we've always cared about energy affordability, but the electricity angle is a new one. We're not just talking about what people pay at the pump, but we're talking about what people pay at the end of the month with their utility bills. So what has largely been an oil and gas affordability conversation is now an electric affordability conversation. And just to level set here, right now in America, there's over 80 million Americans that are struggling to pay their utility bills. That's
Right.
1 in 3 households that are trading off basic expenditures like food, healthcare, rent, insurance, just to keep their lights on. And if you don't pay your utility bills on time, you might get shut off from the power system. And in a modern lifestyle that is so dependent on electricity for groceries, for heating and cooling, for keeping the lights on, for you to basically exist in a modern lifestyle, you need electricity. And we're starting to see just how much it truly is the lifeblood, both at the macro level with the economy writ large and at the micro level with how much it impacts your day to day. And you pointed out the statistic, but the headline from 2025 is that utilities requested $31 billion in rate increases. And that set a record. It didn't just set a record, it was actually double the previous record of any year. And that's a leading indicator for where the issue of utility bills is likely to head into the future. Electric prices over the last 5 years have already gone up 40%, but this, with the 31 billion, a lot of that has not yet hit consumers' wallets and pocketbooks yet. So the pressure is only just growing in a moment where voters and consumers are still concerned about economic issues and where electricity and gas are now the two fastest drivers of inflation. So we are experiencing a new phenomenon here, which is a new politics of electricity, where, as you pointed out earlier, electricity is the new eggs, and consumers are really concerned about what's happening.
Okay. So what is it for, right? That hike, right? It's, you said double. It's a big hike. What are they asking for? What are energy companies asking for? And what do they actually, and how does that actually translate into people's day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are three real big drivers of utility bill increases over the last 5 years. The first is our grid is getting old, it's aging. So a
Yeah.
lot of the power lines that you see across the highways or across, your neighborhoods or backyards, they're reaching the end of their useful life. So it costs a lot of money just for utility companies to replace that infrastructure, to modernize it, and to make sure that, the grid is actually stable and modern. So that's one. Second factor is extreme weather events, whether it's wildfires out west or hurricanes in the
Yeah.
southeast or winter storms in New England. It costs a lot of money for utilities both to respond to those natural disasters and extreme weather events after they happen, but also in preparation for those events. It costs a lot of money to modernize and harden the grid infrastructure as well. So that's costing a lot of money. And
Mm.
third, it's volatile fuel costs. So this is costs like natural gas. For instance, during the Russia-Ukraine crisis, global gas commodity markets were thrown into a tizzy due to the invasion. And what happened is that global gas prices spiked. And because gas is roughly 40% of the US electric mix, rising gas prices mean rising electric prices in the US. And the thing to note about these fuel costs, in addition to the fact that they change so much month to month, is that generally they get passed on directly onto consumers by the utilities. So it's treated as an operational expense. So utility companies neither make a profit nor lose a profit when these fuel costs change, but the consumers bear 100% of the risk. So there's a question of whether that's actually fair for consumers to be the ones that are holding the bag if fuel costs increase. But those are the three main systemic
Okay.
drivers of why utility bills have gone up, and they're likely to persist as issues going forward.
Okay. So that's a really interesting point about the burden. We've heard the term of energy burden and who's holding the burden. So you're saying that the fuel costs that this go up and down, and there's no, accounting for that, right? As it happens, basically is laid on the ratepayer, right? They're absorbing that. And our ratepayers, right? There's ratepayers on the low income who it has a exponentially larger impact on, especially if they're 6% or more of their income is going towards their energy bill. So how does that play out in this incredibly volatile time for, say, and it's even creeping up to moderate income, right? People, everyone's feeling it right now. So what do we say? What do we do about this?
That's right. And part of why I think there's a lot more discussion around this issue is that, to your point, even middle class consumers are feeling the heat and feeling the pressure around rising utility bills. I bet everybody listening to this podcast probably knows either a friend or a family member who has some story about, I used to live in a two-bed house with, two bed, two bathrooms, and my electric bill was this, and suddenly it doubled, and I don't know what's going on. Can you tell me why? And this is something that is now starting to impact a much broader set of the population from a socioeconomic standpoint. But I want to go back to what you were saying, which is that for a lot of Americans, the amount that they pay for their utility bills as a percentage of their income oftentimes has been double digits. Now,
Yeah.
that's kind of crazy for a lot of folks when they first hear that, because a lot of folks maybe only pay 2, 3, 4% sometimes of their income on their utility bills. But for a lot
Hmm.
of lower income folks, it can be upwards of 10, 15, 20% of their income. spent on electric bills. And so that's a pretty staggering statistic when you think about the fact that then you've got groceries, you've got rent as the biggest expense in many cases, or a mortgage, or car payments, or insurance, especially if you're living in some of the vulnerable communities, for instance, in the Southeast with storms, the same
Yeah.
storms that we were talking about, or in the West with wildfire risk. And so these issues, they're all related and compounding. And for a lot of folks, it's reaching a breaking point. So there's certainly a lot of concern around this that's now spanning a much broader income level.
Yeah, I mean, those three pieces are really, like you said, are converging all at once, right? The fuel costs, climate change, if you will, right? Or these events that are happening with our climate, and obviously our aging grid. And here we are at this inflection point, right? What really struck me in your research was that over 50 million Americans reported that they're keeping the temperatures in their home, right, at either an unsafe or unhealthy level to manage their utility bill, right, payments. So that is striking to me, and I've heard a lot of statistics that, right, that's a lot of people making big choices in their life, right? When they have to take a look at, do I have an energy bill, or do I have to pay for food or the medicine? So that was striking. I want to go into a little bit into state by state, right? I don't know if you broke it down that way, but are there any meaningful differences that you have seen, state-wise, or is this really kind of a broad national challenge that all of us are facing right now?
Yeah, well, there's definitely been regional differences in the past of price spikes, but one that I'll just name is the Mid-Atlantic region. It's served by a grid operator known as PJM, which historically sort of stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland, although it covers a much wider range than that across the Mid-Atlantic, stretching from Chicago to all the way up to New Jersey, all the way down to Washington,
Okay,
D.C.,
that's a
but
chunk,
covering,
right?
yep, but covering Indiana, Ohio, Baltimore, D.C., parts of Jersey, Pennsylvania, etc. And a lot of folks saw price spikes of 20 to 30% this past summer. And for that, there's what's called a capacity market in that region, which basically that is a supply and demand market where the grid operator is saying, look, to make sure that we have enough energy resources on the grid to service um, uh, to meet demand that's going to increase in the future, we need to set a price signal so that the generators in that region can supply enough power. And what happened was that there was a huge price spike because there was rising demand from data centers and constricted supply, and that created a situation where prices spiked. So that is a regional issue over the last year that suddenly brought a lot of attention to this
Mm.
question of data centers and the role that they play on utility bills. The reality is that it's a lot more complicated than that. And there's a lot of correlation, but not necessarily causation always between those two issues. And there's a lot of nuance that needs to happen because, frankly, a big reason why utility bills are going up is that the grid is inefficient. So we are not using it efficiently, and utilities have a structural incentive to build new power plants and new power lines because that's how they earn a profit. They earn what's called a return on equity for those capital expenditures. So they generally
Yeah.
like to build new power plants and power lines, and they're using this moment to say, look, we need to build a lot more energy infrastructure. Of course, that's true. We're going to need to build a lot more energy infrastructure, but the question of how much, who pays, and who gets to decide is ultimately the question that we're talking about. But that is one region where there has been this dynamic of rising prices. But part of why this has suddenly become a national issue is that it is truly national in nature, where almost everywhere across the country, we broke it down in our latest report by region and found that across the Midwest, the East, the South, and the West, bills were going up, and that it's no longer just
Mm.
limited to one state or one region.
Right. Okay. You mentioned data centers, right? We could add that to the list too, right? There's a lot of um, energy that's going to be used in many different states, and bills can go up where those data centers are, even though the big AI and data center companies that are saying that many of them are saying they're going to foot the bill on that, but it's all so new. And what's changing here too is that communities are waking up and saying, wait a minute, right? We want a community benefits plan or some say in what's happening. So there's so much transition happening in this moment. That it's not the way it's been always, that a rate goes up, if they bring it to the PUC and we see if it works or doesn't. So it's a really interesting time right now.
That's right.
Um, so another thing that struck me here is that in your reports that 4 out of 5 Americans feel powerless, right, over their power bills. And I want to ask what's driving that. There's so many things, right? But it also indicates to me that this trust in our energy systems is really could be at an all-time low. I don't know. We'll have to talk to more utility execs. But tell me more about this 4 to 5 people, Americans, that are feeling this way and why.
Well, I'd say, how can you blame them? I mean, the
Yeah.
bills have gone up 40% over the last 5 years. Utilities have requested a record 31 billion in 2025, double the previous record. Electric and gas are now the two fastest drivers of inflation, double the rate of inflation. In a moment where, again, economic concerns and pressures have not disappeared, in fact, they remain a top issue of concern for consumers and voters. And it's the clearest signal that we have not been able to successfully bring down the cost of living for folks, or at least the perceived cost of living for a lot of folks. Because the reality is that these prices are going up around electricity. And so I think why voters are frustrated and why consumers are frustrated is for a couple of reasons. One is, and this is our hypothesis, but one is that it changes so much month to month. So you can't budget for these costs because it changes depending on the season, depending on the time of day that you use. Um, uh, uh, the, the seasonality effect and also the fuel price volatility creates a dynamic where your utility bills do change quite a bit. So that's frustrating to a lot of folks. Second is you don't really have a choice. You've got a monopoly who is providing your electricity. You can't really switch to somebody else in most cases. Third is that it's a black box. There's not really transparency into how this works. Fourth is that even if you take out your utility bill, what all those line items mean. What is a fuel adjustment charge? What's a fixed charge? What's delivery charge? What's a service charge? Why am I paying all these different line items? And the fifth is that folks feel like they don't have a say. Part of that is that very few people realize that there's 3 or 5 people, or sometimes 7, but as few as 3 people in their state called public service commissioners that set their utility bills. And there's 200 of these commissioners across the country, across every state, and they oversee more than $200 billion a year on utility spending. As a cohort, these 200 people, $200 billion, that's $1 billion per commissioner. We call them the U.S. Supreme Court Justices of Energy. That's how much power that they have.
That's a good
And
way
yet
of
a lot
putting
of
it.
folks,
Yeah.
exactly, and a lot of folks don't realize that they are the decision makers around how much people pay for energy because they regulate the utility companies. And so that represents an opportunity for folks to make their voices heard is at these commissions to let the commissioners know how they're being impacted by the decisions. And in most of these states, it's the governors that appoint the public service commissioners. And so you can also write to your governor to let them know that the next time they're thinking about a public service commissioner appointment, that they're putting somebody on the commission who's looking out for their interests as consumers. So there's a lot of different intervention points that folks can engage in, but part of it comes down to folks actually understanding that there are avenues to make an impact on their own utility bills that go beyond just turning off your lights. Because there are plenty of folks that have tried that and feel like it's not working because they're using less energy but are paying more for their utility bills. So they don't understand why that's happening. And there are other systemic pressures driving up electric prices that folks need to know exist. And they also need to know who the levers and what the levers of influence are to make sure that they're directing their concern as consumers to the right bodies who can decide based on that.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that because so many of us don't realize that our voice can be heard. There are hearings that happen quite frequently. You can go to your state's website, and look under energy. There's often an energy department and find out more about, or just do a search and you'll find out who they are. And you can, just like you call your senator or, your rep, right? You could really talk to the PUC or Public Utility Commission. So, and have some voice because they're there for the citizens. They're there. They're in that place to represent you, not the utility companies. They work with the utility companies on rates and so forth, but they're really for the people. They're there for the people, right? So, or at least it was set up that way. So I just want to do a little plug. Our next show, we have interviews from real people and real communities in Colorado that we've interviewed with Energy Outreach Colorado and asked them 4 questions, right, on how's it going, what's happening for you right now with this transition. So you'll hear it straight from the mouth of people like you and I, right, that are experiencing this. So please tune into that. Charles is launching us with the data. But that's where it just begins, okay? So I want to you do have strong data here, right? And that, by the way, will be in your report, will be in our show notes, right? But there are limits to what the numbers can capture, truly, right? So what do you think this report does not reflect fully about people's lived experience that leaders should really keep in mind?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, we try to be comprehensive with this report beyond just the data. One of the things that we are trying to integrate going forward is some of those consumer stories. Like, I'll give you an
Right.
example of somebody that I met earlier last year, which is an Uber driver in New Orleans who had to move out of his childhood home because he couldn't afford his utility bills. That's he's a restaurant manager, his wife's a school teacher, he's driving Ubers for extra income.
Mm,
And unprompted, he said that the reason why he had to move out was his utility bills. And so this is driving uh, frustration among consumers in a way that it's just there are so many stories like that. That's just one of the 80 million Americans that are struggling. Um, Going to be excited to hear more about some of the others that you're featuring because everybody's got a story like that.
yes.
And that kind of storytelling and the actual humanization of this issue is crucial
Yeah.
because there's a lot of statistics, there's a lot of numbers, a lot of facts, there's a lot of stuff about the grid, there's a lot of complex stuff about utility regulation and incentive structures and rate design. But at the end of the day, we set up this utility regulatory system over 100 years ago in service of consumers because we said, look, we have invented and commercialized this incredible technology, which is electricity and the electric grid. And we've got to figure out a way to give it and maximize its reach to as many consumers as possible. And so we set up these public utilities commissions to regulate monopoly utility companies in the interest of consumers to advance the public interest. But somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that mission and mandate. And so in this current moment, it's crucial to contextualize this whole conversation around utility bills from the standpoint of specific individuals' stories and how different consumers are being impacted. Because it's truly impacting a wide array of folks. There's breweries that we've talked to that are experiencing rising electric prices that is really significant in terms of
Yeah.
the not just how much the small business is paying, but also the fact that a lot of their traditional customers are no longer able to have as much discretionary income to spend going to bars and actually spending it on things that are beyond the basic essentials. And so it's impacting folks like that. There are other examples of large manufacturing plants that are paying a lot for electricity and are seeing sudden spikes, and that's
Mm.
becoming, impacting their bottom line. There's examples of single moms that, their kids are trying to study and learn at the dinner table, but have to keep lights dim because they're trying to preserve energy. There are so many of those examples, and I think there's no way that we could possibly share all of those. But I would encourage folks to uplift those stories from their local communities to the mayors, to their state legislators, to their members of Congress, to their governors, to their public utilities commissions. Those are essential folks to hear how this issue is impacting different consumers.
Totally. Right. I love that. It's a spectrum of so many people that you wouldn't think. Right. Right. You go out for a beer, right? Now your beer costs more. And then the food, I've seen another spike in food, right? There was a big spike, and then just just the other day I was like, what's going on? Because, there's energy that goes to that, creates food too, right? So all of this is happening all together. So Charles, on our show, we have leaders, right, and energy providers that listen in, right? So I want to ask you, what would you say to them in this moment, right? And what might they still be underestimating about the impact these pressures are having on households?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, what I would say is that if you're a decision maker of any shape, stripe, form, figure, consumers are looking for leadership and action on this issue of utility price spikes and rising concerns around energy affordability. And here's what I would say is that even something like a 3% increase or $2 a month, that may not sound like a lot on paper, but for the 80 million Americans that are already trading off
Mm.
other expenditures that are essential, such as medicine or groceries and food sometimes, or keeping their homes at unsafe or unhealthy temperatures, as you pointed out, that is a material difference because it's not like $2 a month increase from a baseline of no concern. It's already things are very tight, and so an
Yeah.
extra set of costs has the potential to really be the straw that breaks the camel's back. And we're starting to see this kind of this tipping force dynamic play out insofar as there are now, for instance, governors, Republicans, independents, and Democrats that are talking about this issue. Part of the polling that we did last year really showed that this is not a partisan issue. Americans of all political parties are really concerned about this, and they want to see leadership. Doesn't matter if it's a red state or a purple state or a blue state. They want to see leadership from elected officials, policymakers, governors, regulators across the board. And so that's something that I would just say cannot
Mm.
continue to emphasize enough is that what on paper to a decision maker may not sound like a big difference in practice can actually be a force multiplier around pocketbook pressures in a way that creates significant consumer concern in a way that has broader ripple effects as we're starting to see play out.
Right. So it's almost even looking beyond energy because we all of these other factors are happening along with energy, right? And they to be aware of all the other industries, right? Transportation, food and beverage, medicine, childcare, right, are all having an impact. So it's almost like these, not just the energy leaders getting together, but getting together with their other colleagues in other industries. So, what indicators, if any, right, should these leaders be paying close attention to right now if they really want to start to ease on some level, right, the pressures that are happening right now?
Yeah, well, one I would honestly just say is to listen to
Yeah.
consumers, not just listen to them, but go out proactively and understand what's on their minds and to understand what their concerns are and to understand just the dynamic that we were just talking about, which is $5 a month increase. May not sound like a lot, but when you hear about the story of the single mom or the story of the retiree that's on a fixed income, that does change the game when you start to understand why folks are saying that they cannot handle further stress on their utility bills. So that's what I would say is that there needs to be a lot more proactive seeking out of those perspectives to understand how those decisions impact them.
Okay. So, so as we move this conversation, from data into like communities and leaders, what do you hope that decision makers, right, understand from this report, right, before they start, let's say, redesigning or designing processes or responses?
Well, I would say there's also no one size fits all type of consumer. There's different needs of different populations. So again, like a retiree may have a different set of concerns than a single mom, than a family of five. They're all going to experience different challenges around this issue. So that's why I do think that this isn't as simple as just wave a magic wand and your policy fix suddenly will solve everything. But it does require a lot
Mm.
more intentionality around policy design, program design, implementation, all of that, decision making at the regulatory level. Because the concern that a lot of folks have is where is this going to stop? Are my bills going to continue to increase 50% over the 40% of the last 5 years? Are they going to increase 40% again over the next 5 years? And what does that mean in terms of the pressure on the rest of their budgets and things like that? So that is something that I would say is essential, is to actually, again, do the proactive and thoughtful strategic listening to understand what consumers are facing. But the other thing that I would say is there are policy solutions that folks can adopt in advance that would meaningfully address this situation. So, I talked about how the grid is inefficient. Well, across America, we use our grid at roughly 50% efficiency.
Yeah.
And there are solutions that we can deploy, such as grid enhancing technologies, which I describe as ibuprofen for the grid. It doesn't solve all the issues, but it provides some immediate relief, and it can
Mm.
lower the pressures on the grid, free up more electrons, get more juice out of the current system that we've already spent a lot of money paying for, and basically take the fixed cost of the grid and spread it over more users, and therefore lower the per unit price of electricity for consumers. And that would meaningfully tackle this affordability issue. But part of the reason why we don't just do that is because we have a very outdated regulatory system that was, again, set up over 100 years ago that structurally disincentivizes efficiency on the grid because it rewards utility companies financially for the build out of new infrastructure. Now, I want to be very clear. We're going to be needing to spend a lot more money to build new infrastructure just to, for instance, replace and repair aging power lines. But we also ought to take a look at these solutions more near term and that can provide some immediate benefits to consumers and relief to customers. And there
Mm.
are a lot of solutions that are available like that, that we're going to continue to engage different policymakers and different stakeholders on to advance and adopt so that we can really push for a more affordable energy system for folks.
Totally. There are even, you said we're going to have to spend a lot of money on our grid, and we will. We are. There are some really creative financing um, tools, such as securitization, that was always used for closing a coal plant over here, but could it be used for an aging grid over here, right? If we think more creatively. So I see some of these happening, which could reduce, basically, it's an affordability tool, reduce the prices of our electricity. So I hope to see more of this. And what you're saying too, there are a lot of different ways. It's like we're ready for an upgrade all across the board. So Charles, thank you so much for helping us understand the scale of what we're talking about right now and the forces behind what people are experiencing. So how can people learn more about you and your work? Powerlines.
Yeah, well, we partner with a variety of different organizations and always love to hear from folks in terms of just how they're seeing this issue play out in their day to day or line of work or just in their personal lives. So You can learn more about our organization at powerlines.org, and you can feel free to reach out at contact@powerlines.org. And we'd love to get in touch and understand how you're seeing this issue play out, and if you're working on solutions or otherwise tackling this problem, would love to collaborate.
Okay, right on. We'll have all that information in our show notes for sure, right? So this data gives us essential context, right? But like I said, it's the beginning. It's the beginning of the journey, right? In the episodes ahead in our series, we're going to move from the trends, national trends, into next show, the lived experience of people, dealing with the rising costs and how it's impacting their lives. So we're going to be directly hearing from some Colorado communities who are making these trade-offs from every day, and from leaders who are grappling with this issue and how to respond. Because the data can tell us what's happening. And Charles said this, but listening is how we figure out what to do next. So thank you for listening and being here. And as always, remember, we are all in this together. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe to Just Power wherever you get your podcasts. And if you really loved it, leave us a review and tell everyone you know about our podcast. It's going to take all of us to create a clean energy future that leaves no one behind.